Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome back to chapter 15. We're talking about early life. How did life first originate on the planet? And the way life first originated on the planet is the first step is the planet form. The second step is we had to have those compounds in the atmosphere. You add energy to those compounds like nitrogen, like ammonia, like hydrogen, like methane, like water. You add energy to those things and we can form simple organic compounds like amino acids, like urea, like some of the precursors to RNA. The next thing that happens is I enclose it. And once I've enclosed that stuff in a simple membrane, now I've made a, not quite a sealed system, but I've made a system that's a lot more difficult for stuff to get in and out. And now I can make these reactions happen a lot faster. These reactions like making proteins, these reactions like the third step, or the last step, which is the self-replication of RNA, of a nucleic acid. Remember, in translation, the piece of messenger RNA is all that is followed, and that's what ends up with the finished product. That's the instructions for the finished product for a protein. So a sequence of RNA can be a full set of instructions. I don't need to do the DNA step. I can just skip DNA and make products directly from RNA. So we've made it as far as making simple living things. Well, the last step that we need is they need an energy source. They need food. This is our fourth step. They need food so that they can be living things, so they can metabolize. We think that the very first ecosystems likely formed at these things that we call hydrothermal vents, these things that we call smoker chimneys. And I'm not sure if you can see very well what we're showing here but there's these chimneys sticking up, and these chimneys are blowing out what appears to be like black smoke. That black smoke is not black smoke. That black smoke is sulfur-laden, superheated water. The sulfur compounds, like hydrogen sulfide, the sulfur compounds that's in this water have energy in them. The very first living things, likely what they did was they took those sulfur compounds that's being spewed out of these hydrothermal vents. These hydrothermal vents are rips in the floor of the ocean. They are so far down. They're at the bottom of the ocean, in the deepest, darkest places of the ocean. Simple single-celled organisms, probably related to bacteria, were floating in this water. They used the sulfur compounds that's being spewed out as their energy source. They used those sulfur compounds to make food, and then they used that food to feed themselves. We talked about this when we talked about photosynthesis. We talked about chemoautotrophs. Chemo, using chemicals for energy. Auto, using carbon dioxide for the carbon source. Troph, making their own food. Using chemicals for energy to turn carbon into food. These hydrothermal vents were probably their very first ecosystem on the planet. We still find them today. We still find them. These are a bunch of worms that grow up around these hydrothermal vents, and what these worms do is these worms pull those bacteria out of the water and eat them. That's our guess as to what were the first ecosystems. In chapter 14, we talked about evolution. We talked about natural selection, artificial selection, sexual selection. We talked about how one species goes to become another species. Well, that very last slide that we saw was the butterflies, right? One species of butterfly splitting into two species of butterflies. That's referred to as microevolution. Microevolution is how one population changes from one species to multiple species. What we're about to talk about now is macroevolution. Macroevolution is the history of the major evolutionary events on the planet. The age of the Earth, the history of the Earth, is broken up into 4 unequal sections. Remember, we talked about it a few slides ago. How old is the planet? The planet is 4.6 billion years old. The first age of the planet, the first section of history of the Earth, is basically the first 4 billion years. This is referred to as the Precambrian. It's called the Precambrian Era because we'll talk about what the Cambrian is and why this is the era that started before it. The Precambrian lasted for about 4 billion years. So, of the 4.6 billion years of the planet, the first part of it is the first 4 billion. This shows the entire timeline of the age of the planet. This is from the beginning, 4.6 billion years ago, until present day. The Precambrian is from here to here. From the beginning until right there. What first happened? We first see life somewhere around 3.6 billion years ago, which again we said that it took life about 1 billion years to work out how to work. It took life about 1 billion years to get the processes of life sorted out. After that, we have about another 1 billion years until we finally get oxygen in the atmosphere. Somewhere around in here is when photosynthesis first showed up. Remember, what is one of the byproducts of photosynthesis? One of the byproducts of photosynthesis is oxygen. When oxygen was first put into the atmosphere, it was a poison. Remember, it took a really long time for any sort of a eukaryote, anything that could use oxygen, it took them about 1.8 billion years after the first living things until we get the first things that can probably live in oxygen. So this section right here, this 700 million years right there, that is, it was probably a terrible time on the planet because there were these things, these terrible things called algae, which were putting out oxygen, this horrible poison into the atmosphere that was killing everything. Life evolved the ability to use this stuff that we call oxygen with these things that we call mitochondria. And after we could make mitochondria, you go from single-celled eukaryotes, multicellular eukaryotes, until we get to this major breaking point right here, which is about 600 million years ago, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Do note that we see our first animals right around that time. Also, one last thing I want you to see. What does this say right up there? It says the colonization of land, which means during this entire 4 billion year history of the planet, this beginning 4 billion years, where was all life? If it started in the ocean, it had stayed in the ocean. Life did not come out on land until when? Until after the Precambrian was over. All life began where? All life was in the ocean. It was prokaryotes only for about the first 1.5 billion years after life formed. So from about 3.5 billion years ago until about 2 billion years ago. At that time, these things called Cyanobacteria. Earlier I said they were algae. I lied. Algae don't show up until we get those first single-celled eukaryotes. The first photosynthetic things were called Cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria first started to do this process called photosynthesis, this terrible, awful process that makes this horrible, poisonous waste product called oxygen. The oxygen that they put out eventually built up into the atmosphere and was a poison and killed off most living things on the planet until there were these things called mitochondria that were able to use that oxygen. Aerobic cellular respiration helped the prokaryotes to survive once they sorted out how to do it. And it actually took them a long time to be able to sort out how to do this thing called use oxygen. This graphic right here is important because, again, I want to show you something. The most important thing to look at is the orange line. This is, again, the history of the planet. The orange line is the Precambrian. The other 3 eras in the history of the planet are here. We'll talk about this one in just a minute. It's called the Paleozoic, this green one. This purple one, notice how each time we go it gets shorter This purple one, this is called the Mesozoic. This last green one is called the Cenozoic. This last green one is where we are today. Just to give you a frame of reference. Do you see how skinny that green one is? Oh, okay, well that must be like recorded history or something, right? No. That green section is 65 million years. That is 65 million years. This is about 200 million years. This is about 300 million years. And this is 4 billion.